Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Want to learn how to support the channel and its mission to normalize atheism and deconversion? Stay tuned to the end of the video. This is part 8 of a series entitled Questionable Witnesses, an Atheist Teaches Life of Christ. Today we'll be looking at Luke 1, 57 through 80, John the Baptist is born. I'm teaching the Gospels much like I did many times in my churches as a pastor over the years, but now I'm teaching it as an atheist. The whole issue of this series has been to get to how many witnesses do the Gospel accounts actually have, and are they credible? The Bible's omission of 2 or 3 witnesses is our first test. The next test is modern scholarship, which is a little more rigorous as to provide the truth or falsehood of claims with other criteria. Plus, I want to make any remarks about the story that I think are pertinent. I also want to make some deconversion notes. To summarize the text, Elizabeth gives birth to a baby boy and begins to say that that boy's name is John. The people there question this, as there's no one in their family that has that name, and they assume Zacharias would name the child after himself, given his age. But when they ask him directly, he writes down the boy's name is John, which is much to their amazement. It is at this point that Zacharias is finally able to speak, which he hasn't been able to do since his encounter with the angel in the temple, and he's filled with the Spirit, and he breaks out into song. A song that is prophetic and has several Old Testament quotes in it. Psalm 106:10, which talks about how the Messiah would deliver them. Malachi 3:1, which references the prophecy about John being the forerunner to Jesus. And Isaiah 9:1 and 2, where it references this is the time that God would shine his light into the world. This one last verse that basically says that John grew up, that he became strong in the Spirit, and they lived in the deserts until the time of his showing to Israel. So our first test is the one that the Bible gives. A lot of Christians up to this point have been ignoring this problem that the anonymous nature of the Gospels all possess, and that is the problem of the Bible standard of 2 or 3 witnesses. That is very much part of the Old Testament standard of proving the legality of testimony. And for any event that is supposed to be confirmed, the Bible then violates this rule of 2 or 3 witnesses with the Gospels themselves by not giving us an account from 2 or 3 confirmed witnesses. It's a contradiction of expectation from one testament to the other, one that could have been easily foreseen by an omniscient God and corrected. It's almost like the writers of the Gospels were just collecting stories about Jesus and not actual confirmed accounts of his life. It's the anonymous nature of the writers of the Gospel that necessitates speculation as to whether the account ever happened from a biblical point of view even. But once again, Luke is our only account of the story, and the writer doesn't name himself or herself or where they got the story. It could be said that Elizabeth and Zacharias are witnesses of the birth of their own child, and there's a crowd of people at this event. But the existence of Elizabeth and Zacharias are only in the Gospels of Luke, and none of the guests are named or provide an affidavit that this actually happened. So basically, we would dismiss all of this as hearsay evidence, and it doesn't even meet the low bar criteria of the Old Testament's 2 or 3 witnesses, which seems once again to be ignored by an all-knowing God who supposedly inspired this gospel. Outside the Bible, scholarship is left holding an empty sack about Zacharias, Elizabeth, and the birth of John. There's really not much to say here, as the only place that the story appears is here, and the only place Zacharias and Elizabeth appear is Luke. As for the story itself, it's a nice birth of a child story, but the whole point is to fit into the theology of the Messiah that he would have a forerunner, and John in the story would be that forerunner. But we can see that not only is Jesus who has his legend growing with each telling of the tale. In Mark, John is the start of the story, but we don't get his background. He just appears and starts preaching that, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and then all of a sudden he becomes the forerunner of Jesus. But we don't know very much about him from Mark's account. So Luke seeks to provide one, but this is the only gospel writer that does. When we look at the entire account as a whole, when we look at John being born, it's kind of weird to me that this is the only place this appears. It seems like it would be a much more important thing to Messianic theology that they would want to know where the origin story of John is. But once again, we just don't get any kind of scholarship about this. We don't get anything that says, hey, this is confirmed in this account or that account or whatever. I've been given a lot of criticism of the city all so far. One criticism was, well, the stories only include what is necessary to include. Well, then necessary for who? Okay, it seems to me that different people are going to have different needs as far as standards of evidence, and that an omniscient God who's inspiring the gospel would know that and provide various levels of standards so that everybody would be convinced that the story is true. But that doesn't happen. And this is one of the things that has bothered me throughout this series as far as the criticism of Christians. They don't seem to get how very, very problematic that Luke being anonymous is. And this story actually kind of illustrates that problem, okay? Because we literally only have one gospel writer's account of this. If some person told you the story of a birth of a baby boy, that's pretty mundane. But when you add the element of the miracle of the person was not allowed to speak until they gave the child the name John, now you've added an element of God not allowing this person to speak that you now have to provide evidential proof for. I know that I'm going to get pushback on miracles at this point, but as one of my followers pointed out, you even have the problem of this whole story, which starts at the beginning of Luke and now has reached its conclusion with Zacharias's praise. You know, when you look at Zacharias as a character, he starts off seeing a vision of an angel. You haven't proven that angels even exist. Okay, so there's your first problem. An angel is a mythical figure. If I told you that a character in a story had a mythical vision of a fairy or the queen of fairies, you would immediately say, oh yeah, that's fiction. But an angel appears to a guy and you accept it as true, but you don't even have any evidence for yourself that angels even exist. Okay, and you certainly don't have any empirical proof of that, just as angels are just as mythological as fairies. Okay, so you have that problem. And so at the end of the story, when Zacharias is able to finally speak, the miracle is that he was basically not allowed to speak. But you have no evidence other than the text says so. And so the whole character arc of Zacharias at this point in this story seems to be a little bit odd to me, because he's just kind of a bit character kind of there. You know, he's obviously the father of John. You know, and basically he says in the early part of the text that he goes home and gets busy with his wife and she gets pregnant. So it's that kind of issue right there, you know, of an old man, but we're never told exactly how old they are. And given that women there are documented cases of women getting pregnant up to age 70, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that an older woman could get pregnant. So it's not really a miracle there. It's just the whole circumstance of it is billed as important. The whole story here is designed to build John as the forerunner. There was obviously, you know, more stories told about John the Baptist, and Luke is one of the few writers that collects those stories. In fact, he's the only one. And this is very, very problematic. A lot of you theists are missing the point of two things. One, the 2 or 3 witnesses standard is a internal contradiction, because it's basically setting a standard of what the Gospels could have lived up to, and it's low bar. Having 2 or 3 witnesses is a low bar evidential standard, okay? And the Gospel writers don't even meet that, okay? And it's weird that you would set a standard in the Bible, that God would set a standard in the Bible and then follow him himself. Now, it's not completely weird. He does this a lot. You know, he gives several commands to humanity that he doesn't seem to have a problem with violating himself. So he's not a very good example of how to follow his own commands. So, but here he gives, you know, supposedly an evidential standard in the Old Testament of 2 or 3 witnesses and then doesn't follow it. And this story is a great illustration of that, because it seems to me that some of the gospel writers, other gospel writers, would have been inspired to write this same tale, maybe put it a little bit differently, but not contradict this tale. And they don't do that, okay? The fact of the matter is that if all the gospels are inspired by God, God is very, very silly at times, and quite frankly doesn't live up to his own expectations, which is kind of weird for a God. It's almost like these were written by different men who used each other. I got the criticism pushback of one person mentioned to me that Matthew was probably the first person to write, but that makes it even more problematic, because now you have Mark literally chopping off parts of Matthew to get his account. Then Mark isn't writing anything. He's just editing out stuff and then just slapping what he thinks is authentic together, and he's almost making an editorial comment. Yeah, all that other stuff I didn't include that Luke has or Matthew has. Yeah, I can't, I don't think that happened. Okay, you could literally say that. It's much better to have Mark writing first because it actually bolsters your case. So a lot of the criticism of this series is all this other stuff, but you still haven't hit the main problem. Your anonymous gospels automatically lead to speculation. You have anonymous sources where these stories came from, leads to speculation. You don't have 2 or 3 witnesses, which is a basic low bar criteria for evidential standards. Even today, that would be considered, okay, and you don't even have that, okay? And somehow you're supposed to believe this. This story has, people that are, caused to not speak, and now they can speak. Very easy to pull off. They see angels, not verified to exist. It's as comical as a Greek hero seeing a faun or a satyr, okay, and taking some sort of lessons from them. I'm not trying to be rude, but if you're believing these stories, if you're believing the Gospels as true, you're basically believing something that is right up there with, Hercules and Perseus and all the rest of them in Greek mythology or Egyptian mythology with heroes. There's tons of hero stories, and there's tons of stories of gods and goddesses that have all these fantastical creatures and things happening to them. You don't have a differentiation between them and your own story in the Gospels. There is no difference. The evidential standard is the same, which is you haven't met it. Now, looking at this story even further, you have the character of John is being built up, okay? Whereas Mark doesn't really build up the character of John, he just drops him in the story and starts the story with him. Now we have Luke who's trying to build up the character of John and make him more significant. And so it really does speak to a growing legend, or people telling stories around the campfire after when questions start to arise, well, who was John the Baptist and everything else. The other thing that comes up is John's life, because there's that one verse at the end. And there's a lot of theories about whether John was part of the Essenes communities, the various communities in the desert and the wilderness. While I can admit that it's not a very big claim that somebody may have been part of that, considering they were living in that area, according to the story, we don't really have any account that actually John lived there other than, some of the other ones. Now, the other ones will say he lives in the wilderness or came out of the wilderness and his diet was whatever and whatever. But we need to remember that this is, once again, the only account of John the Baptist's childhood and upbringing and youth, okay, as a one-verse line, and that doesn't really give us a lot to go on. When John speaks, he does sound very much like some of the Essene literature, or at least he was influenced. He was certainly, you get the idea that a lot of people, even back then, were influenced by the Book of Enoch. And so there's that aspect of it. In fact, that's where the whole idea of angels probably came from for the entire story. From a deconversion standpoint, the first thing that you have to realize, and I was getting to that with some of my earlier remarks, that to believe this story, you have to believe in angels, the whole story arc. Okay, I'm bringing this arc to a close because this part will be concluded with this video. The part of John the Baptist's ministry and the announcement of Mary that she's going to have a baby and so on. So we have this story, but to believe the story, you're right up there with people who believe in fairies. You're right up there with people who believe in unicorns. You're right up there with people that you have this character as an angel that starts this story off with Zacharias, and it now concludes here. When we look at this story arc of this particular part of Jesus' life and ministry and John's life and ministry, we really have a lot of mythical characters that haven't been proven. And once you are deconverting and you realize that angels are right up there with fairies and dragons and all the rest of it, it's that same level of proof for their existence that all those other things I just mentioned have. part of your deconversion is to realize that how easy it is to be indoctrinated into believing mythology as true. And you're no different. I want to give you some encouragement there. You're no different than anybody else that falls for a lot of other things over the millennia. It's a human trait to want to believe things or want to appease one's parents when the parents are teaching you these things. So it's not unusual, and it's not something you should be embarrassed about necessarily, but understand that that's what it is. You're being asked to believe in mythological things. Anecdotal stories don't help you with that. Just because somebody says, "Oh, I saw an angel here," well, what's your evidence that an angel actually exists? Okay, it's like saying there's magically delicious leprechauns. Okay, if you're going to sit there and tell me you believe angels exist, then it's up to you to prove that angels exist and give me some empirical evidence. And this all starts with an angel and ends with a guy that talks and says his name is John and then breaks out in prophecy. This whole arc of this story hinges on the existence of angels because Mary sees one. There's this whole angelic thing, which very Book of Enoch-ish, so to speak. And so there's a lot of things that the writer of Luke is drawing from that are mythological elements in other books, like the Book of Enoch with the whole story of angels and things like that. And I just don't see how you could, as a person deconverting, not realize that this is, angels are just as mythological as fairies or unicorns or fauns and satyrs and all the rest of it, centaurs. There's just this mythological element that's to it. And once you realize that, then you realize the whole rest of the story is probably made up too. I really feel that of all the story parts, this is something that was very much made up and added to the story to answer some questions. Where did John come from? Where did Jesus come from? And you see both Luke and Matthew kind of responding to some of those questions. And that's all it really is. I want to thank everybody for stopping by. I'm, of course, very interested in what you'll have to say in the comments. As always, like, share the video, do the things that you do to help me out. I appreciate every one of you that does that. Thank you very much. If you want to support the channel, PayPal link is in the description. There's also super chat, super thanks are always welcome. I've had some very generous people over the last few weeks. Thank you very much. You guys keep me going along. But the best way to support the channel is become a citizen of the Rabyd Nation, become a member. Your membership options will be presented to you when you hit the join button, and they all come with different perks. So make sure you take advantage of that if that's what you want to do and support my work to normalize atheism and deconversion. And as always, live your best life. You only get one go around and then it's over. So make sure you're taking all your time, money, and opportunities and spending them on yourself, the people you love and you care for, and to make this a better world. You'll be happier if you do. And don't waste them on the trappings of religion and faith, because that's a dead end. I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.